born for a time such as this. Such a well-coined phrase, especially in Christian circles, a phrase that we know really, really well. And obviously in this instance it's applying to Queen Esther. But here we are in 2018, born for a time such as this. We're not here by accident in 2018, probably not even here today by accident, here by divine appointment. And Terry often says, and I always have to listen really hard, so you can listen really hard as well, that we are geographically assigned by God, DNA designed, and physically equipped for our God-given assignment. Whether we feel like that's true for us or not, it is true. God has plans for us. In fact, if you look at Jeremiah 29:11, he says, I know the plans I have for you. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. God has plans for us, and they're significant. They may not feel significant to us, but as we go along today, you'll see your plans, the plans and purposes that God has for you are extremely significant. Every day that we have is our God-given opportunity to work towards achieving God's plans, and we have an opportunity to learn, to grow, to flourish as we press into God. Very exciting opportunities. And it's from this perspective that I've looked at the life of Esther. I could have called it Leadership Lessons from the Life of Esther, but I chose to call it For a Time Such as This, because I want to focus also on purpose in each of our lives. I think that's very significant in Esther's life, and we need to see that in our own lives. What today's session is not a study on women in leadership, but it is a study on a woman who was a leader. I would hate for people to think that the things that we teach today about a woman in leadership relate only for women. What Esther teaches us is as relevant for the women as it is for the men. And we need to establish that platform today before I start. So all of us, men and women, can learn much from Esther's leadership. So there are two main areas of focus today: pursuing our purpose, and then the other element that we're going to look into is challenging, what I'm calling challenging up. Challenging up because Esther had to challenge upwards to get the result she needed. In fact, as high up as you could possibly get. Yes, he was her husband, but he was the king. So we're going to look at challenging up, but I would like to also state up front as well that although we're looking at challenging upwards, when you need to challenge people in any context, whether it's upwards, downwards, sideways, it doesn't really matter. The principles that we will go through today will apply in all situations where challenge is required, but we're specifically looking at challenging upwards. And this is where Esther finds herself having to challenge upwards. She's in the unenviable position of having to take her petition to the king. And I say unenviable because there's protocol that needs to be followed when you approach a king, even when you're the wife in this instance. And because she was unable to follow protocol, the danger was that she could lose her head in the process. She literally had to risk her life. So let's start there with Esther. I'm going to go back just a little bit into the story because I can't assume that all of you have read the whole story of Esther. Just to give you a little bit of context. The king's name was Xerxes, that was his Greek name, or Ahasuerus. He was the ruler of the Persian Empire, which was the empire of the day. It was massive. And he was the ruler there, and he was holding a banquet in his court. Initially, he held it for his courtiers and the dignitaries that were visiting, and then he opened it up to all the people in the land. And they were invited into the palace to celebrate. They'd had days of drinking and merriment, and now King Xerxes has decided he would like to show off his very, very beautiful wife, who's called Vashti. He calls her to come with her crown and display herself to everyone at the party. Now, Vashti refuses to do this. The commentaries that I read on this, because I remember when I first heard about this, I thought, boy, here's an example of an unsubmissive wife. But when I went through the commentaries and had a look at what happened with Vashti, what the commentators believe happened is that the king had ordered her to come only in her crown, not just with her crown, only in her crown, and expose herself in her full nudity to everyone to appreciate her beauty. Well, sorry guys, but I can understand why the lady said no. And unfortunately, the king took this very badly, and so did all the other men there, because then now the reaction was, what's going to happen to the rest of the women in the kingdom? They're not going to follow Vashti's example. So after much discussion and debate, King Xerxes decides to remove Vashti as queen, and she's banished from his presence permanently thereafter. And then his advisors come up with a wonderful plan. It sounds like something from the Bachelor program on TV. We will bring all these beautiful women before you, all the young ones, and then you pick the one that you like. Well, this appealed greatly to King Xerxes, and that's exactly what they did. And one of these that was selected was Esther. Now, Esther had no parents. She was living with Mordecai, who was her cousin, much older cousin, who was looking after her. And she was brought into the palace, and for a period of 12 months, these girls, sounds like a wonderful 12 months of pampering and everything else that these girls had. They were prepared for the king. And then she found favor in his eyes, and she was selected and made queen. Esther does not reveal to the king that she's Jewish. Mordecai has actually given her express instructions that she may not reveal her identity as a Jew to the king. Shortly after she's made queen, Mordecai, her cousin, hears about a plot that's afoot to assassinate the king, and he advises Esther, and they put a stop to this whole assassination process. And his bravery and service to the king is recorded in the King's Book of Chronicles. The next thing that you need to take note that happens is that the king appoints a prime minister, and he appoints a guy called Haman to be the prime minister. And Haman calls himself an Agagite. Interesting term to call himself Agagite, because according to the records, there was no group of people called Agagites at all. But there had been a King Agag. And King Agag, if you remember your stories about Saul, when Saul was appointed king, he was told by God very clear instructions to attack the Amalekites. The king of the Amalekites then was King Agag. And what happened is that Saul goes into battle, he defeats them as God has told him he would, but God has expressly told Saul, you have to kill every woman, as shocking as this may be, that another issue for debate another day, as shocking as it may be, kill every woman, every child, every man, all livestock, everything. And then the Lord reveals to Samuel the prophet that Saul has not done this. And his words to Samuel, I am now really sorry that I made Saul king. It's quite something to think about God being sorry. When I read that, I thought, sure, it really sort of hits you here. God was sorry he'd made Saul king. And Samuel goes to see King Saul, and the first thing he says, what is this bleating that I hear? Because, of course, it's all these sheep and cattle and everything that he's brought back that he shouldn't have. And then Saul tries to get really clever. It's actually quite a smart response. But you see, I brought it because now I can sacrifice all these wonderful animals to God. But, of course, God knows the truth. You can't hide truth from God. He knows everything. And Samuel informs Saul that God has now rejected you as king. And King Agag has been captured by Saul. Remember, God said no one was to survive? King Agag was captured by Saul, and actually Samuel had to kill him to complete what he thought was the completion of God's task. But now, many years later, back in Susa, we have Haman the Agagite, a descendant of King Agag, who actually shouldn't be around, should he? No, because it's interesting to note, I know this is just a little bit of a side, this is just for free. When you have, when you sin and you do things like Saul did, consequences arise. These were very serious, far-reaching consequences that came up much later on in the history of Israel. I just found that quite an interesting thing to actually consider. So what happens now is you've got a Haman, prime minister, and guess who he hates? He hates Jewish people. And Mordecai has now, he's refusing to bow down to this man when he walks through the gates because he's Jewish. He just won't do it. So they report this to Haman, who now makes a decision that he is going to kill Mordecai. Not only is he going to kill Mordecai, he's going to obliterate all the Jews that are in the kingdom. So very serious consequences coming from Saul's disobedience. He obtains permission from King Xerxes to do this, pays a certain amount of money. I don't know how that worked, but he paid 10,000 talents of silver to get this decree issued, and he cast lots, and on the 13th month of Adar, Adar happens to be March in our calendar, he sends a decree out, all the Jews, if you spot a Jew, you may kill them, and you may take all their property. So Mordecai finds out about this, and he calls all the Jews to a time of mourning and fasting. And he decides the only person he knows who's got the king's ear is Esther. And this is where she comes into the story big time, because he now tells her what is happening and he asks her to intervene. So what do leaders do when they're in situations like this? Interestingly, when Esther is confronted with this situation, one of her other famous statements is, if I perish, I perish. I will do what I have to do, but if I perish, I perish. So what is it leaders do? What was Esther going to do? Leaders do. They do things. That is what leadership is all about. A good question to ask yourself right at the outset is, why do leaders lead? Could be for recognition, position, but those are not real leaders. Real leaders take the lead for a better future for all concerned. Good leaders. That's what they do. They see problems. Sorry, Doug, can we just, I'm missing half of my... Sorry, we had a few technical difficulties to start with, and I've got a couple of clips, and we're going to have to be super quiet because these old big speakers are really not so great. Okay, so they do what needs to be done. They see problems, and they find solutions. That's what leaders do. I don't know how many of you are watching MasterChef at the moment, MasterChef Australia. It's very interesting when they're in a group dynamic to watch what happens. Next time you're watching, just observe, because they always appoint a leader for the group, and observe the dynamics of the group as it goes on. You get different personalities in the group. Some of them come with all the problems. Some of them come with problems and solutions. You can see straight away who the leaders are, because that's what leaders do. They see problems and find solutions. They don't sit on the sideline and wait for things to happen. And I love this statement, and I'd like you just to have a little bit of thought, just let it sort of rest with you a little bit. They feel leaders that is, feel and respond to the weight of what God has put inside them. Now, every single one of you here is a leader. You are going to feel that weight at some stage of what God has put inside you that He wants you to respond to in a manner of leadership. But it's always, always for a better future, a preferred future for all concerned. Leaders then summon up the courage to take the challenge, especially when you're challenging upwards. It does take a fair amount of courage. Interestingly, Esther and Mordecai both had solutions as to the way forward. Mordecai, of course, he would say that, said, you must go see the king. He wasn't going to see the king. You must go see the king, Esther, and beg for mercy for your people. And then she sends him a message back and she says, but she hasn't been seen by the king for over 30 days. If she goes without permission, it could be the end of her, literally. She could be put to death. That was the law. So Mordecai sends her a reply back and he says, no, you have to go. You cannot presume that you yourself will even escape this decree. It will be the end of possibly you and your entire family. And then he implies something that's very interesting and very challenging for us as leaders. He implies if she doesn't do this, God will find another way for His people, the Jews. That's a very sobering thing for us as leaders. When God wants you to do something, and if you don't do it, He's going to find someone else to do it in your stead. And then He says that very famous phrase to her, perhaps you were born for a time such as this. And then Esther comes up with a plan of her own, and she instructs Mordecai to get all the Jews in the kingdom together in Susa. They have to fast, but we're talking a serious fast now. No eating and no drinking of any sort whatsoever for 3 days. After they've done that, then she says she will go to the king. She and her servants will also fast. And that's when her famous phrase comes, if I perish, I perish. And that's what leaders do. When they make statements like, if I perish, I perish, they put their stake in the ground. You make your decision as a leader, and then you stand by it. Now, I'm going to show you a little clip. You're going to have to be super quiet because it's such a cute little clip. But I don't know if you've seen Seinfeld on TV. It's quite an old program now. I think his name Jerry Seinfeld. And he runs this pub, and he's got this friend George there, and Mara. George has his girlfriend Mara. And just so I can give you a little insight, very quick insight, he is planning to break up with Mara. That's the plan. And that's where this clip starts. And this is where he begins with Mara. Okay. One of them was going to put his stake in the ground. He was not very successful. Her stake was in the ground, and boy, did she stand by it. Okay, so just a funny little illustration of how you can put your stake in the ground. But here's a real-life illustration. I don't know if you've ever heard of Charles Curtis Flood, more well known as Kurt Flood. And he paid the price for putting his stake in the ground. He was a professional baseball player. He played for St. Louis Cardinals in the 60s. And in those days when they signed contracts, they were virtually owned by their team. And what used to happen is that the teams would regularly trade off players from one team to another. And this team would see a player that they wanted who had that particular skill, and then they would send a player from their side and they'd do a swap over. So that would be like one of our rugby players who's a lion being told you have to now go join a shark. That's a big thing. You're changing from Gauteng, you're going to KwaZulu-Natal. And that's what they did to these players. And Flood refused, the first ever. And it caused a huge uproar in the baseball community. And because he'd signed contracts, it was a whole messy process. But Flood stood his ground. He said, my family comes first. He wasn't willing to uproot his family and move them. And he brought up an interesting point in front of the courts, and he said, the way we are run as players is tantamount to slavery. We have no say over our lives. So he got hate mail, he got death threats, they didn't play him for the entire season just because they were being particularly peevish, which was silly because he was such a brilliant player. And 4 years later, and at this point Kurt Flood has lost his business, it's gone bankrupt. People wouldn't work with him because of what he had done. 4 years later, the court ruled in his favor. And actually, because of him, today, you have what is called the free agency system that they use with sports players today. This man stood his ground, but he paid the price for standing his ground, and leaders do that. And Esther came to that point where she realized she was going to put her stake in the ground, but she knew what the price might be to put her stake in the ground. When I was going through this and I thought about putting stake in the ground, it was funny. I thought, isn't this exactly what Jesus did? He literally put his stake in the ground. That's the highest price you can possibly pay for putting your stake in the ground. So, now we're going to look at point 2. Leaders know change is a challenge. If you're wanting to bring change, if you're wanting to challenge, there's got to be a process that comes with this. And most systems are designed to help maintain the status quo. If you think about it, that actually makes a lot of sense. Organizations are not putting their systems in place so it can change on a daily basis. You set your course, you know where you're going, and so basically we design everything to keep on track. So there's going to be some resistance when you bring in change. Plus we have this view, and there's some merit to this. Why fix it if it isn't broken? But then we're not just anybody, we're leaders, and leaders challenge processes. Why do they challenge processes? For a preferred future. If you remember anything I say today, remember that one. Leaders challenge for a preferred future. What you do need to know is when you're going through a challenge process is that we're not all going to see eye to eye. Just bear that in mind always. We can look at the same thing and we'll view it completely differently. Anyone who's married can definitely agree with me on that one. Husband and wife, men are from Mars and women are from Venus, that's what they say. Because we look at the same thing and see it so very differently. So you have to bear that in mind when a challenge process is underway. Plus, we're naturally attracted to opinions that validate our viewpoint. And now here you come with a challenge against their current viewpoint to change it. And the other thing you need to take note of is that different opinions can feel like a form of rejection. This is a bumper sticker, this last thing. There are 2 things I hate: change and the way things are. Isn't that so true? We don't want to leave things just as they are, but we also don't necessarily enjoy the change process. Great leaders don't get defensive. Okay, that was a big challenge for me because I'm clearly not a great leader, because I do get defensive, definitely, from time to time, and I'm sure most of you do too, if you're actually honest with yourself. But there's a reason for not being defensive. Leaders embrace change. They know, especially when it's for the greater good. They will embrace the change. They will listen to the change. However, the more passionate and invested you are in something, and if you're talking about your boss or another leader, could be a pastor or your parents, when you're challenging upwards, the harder it is for you to bring about change. Sometimes the person you're challenging has invested years and years into establishing the organization or whatever, the church, whatever it might be, and even their own substance into it. And now you come with a challenge. Change can be interpreted also by people as a criticism of the past. In fact, sometimes when you change something, people secretly hope that it'll fail when you're finished, because they like to see what they did remain in place. And that's just the honest truth. That's how it works. And sometimes when you get challenged about something you've set up, so we're remembering now, this is how the boss is going to feel when I challenge him. You start to question yourself. Did I make a bad decision there? What we need to understand as leaders is that we're going to establish something. Change needs to come to what we establish. It needs to go from good to great, better to best, success to significance. So we should be glad when people come in with something better. And that's why we shouldn't be defensive as leaders. We do need to check our timing and our approach when we do these things. It was very interesting to see how Esther approached this with the king. Very interesting approach, and you'll understand it a bit better as we go along. She does go to the king. He puts forward the royal scepter, which means that she may go in without losing her head, and she invites the king to a dinner with her. And that's how she approaches this situation. So maybe her mother taught her the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. I'm not sure, but that was her approach. Now, here's a wonderful story about a company called Chick-fil-A. Sadly, not here in South Africa. I've always had a special place in my heart for Chick-fil-A. When I was doing my master's, this was one of the companies that we used to study quite a lot. What was special about Chick-fil-A is that they made a stand. They put a stake in the ground and said, we will not open on a Sunday. We're a Christian organization. We believe our staff should be in church on Sunday. We believe we should be in church on Sunday. And it caused quite a bit of a scene in America when they first put their stake in the ground. However, today, it's a very well-established company. But there's a very wonderful example within their company of a man who challenged upwards. And the way he did it was so, so clever. His name was Shane Todd. And he owned a franchise in Athens, Georgia. And this was back in 2006. He was very entrepreneurial and very innovative, and he'd run surveys at his shop with all his customers, and they had given him feedback and said, we want something more like a dessert or something sweeter on the menu. In fact, the major consensus that was coming through, we want milkshakes. So now, if you know much about the food industry and franchises and how they work, you don't have the freedom to do what you want to do. You have to do what they tell you may do. So he put representation through to head office, and he said, this is what the surveys show, we would like to bring in milkshakes. And it took ages for them to reply. Things got stuck in the pipeline. I'm sure it's the usual red tape, the whole story. Eventually, after quite a long period of time, they came back and said no. The reason they said no is because our policy is that things have to be made in super fast time, and milkshakes take too much time, so the answer is no. Well, Todd decided he wasn't going to accept just a no. So what he did, at his own expense, he bought the milk and the ice cream, and they practiced, a little group of them, they practiced and practiced and practiced until they could produce a quality milkshake in super speed time. When he had done that, he was a bit naughty, I think, but what he did is he started to sell it at his outlet. And it was hugely successful. And of course it got to the ears of head office eventually, didn't it? So on his doorstep arrives the Senior Vice President of Operations. Now this is the man, he's the decision maker. If he says no, it's no. So what Shane Todd does, he said, okay, I want to put a challenge to you. You make 2 Diet Cokes in the time that, if you can make 2 Diet Cokes faster than I can make a milkshake, we won't run the milkshakes in the shop. And this guy took up the challenge. He really thought he'd be, and when you think about it, to put 2 Diet Cokes together is not a lot to do. He took up the challenge, and Todd knew, because they timed it and perfected it, and they could get the milkshake done in super fast time. The quality was more than acceptable to Chick-fil-A, and eventually, immediately he carried on selling his milkshakes, but eventually it became milkshake and was an offering in all of Chick-fil-A's. And in fact, remember, this whole process started 2006. In 2008, their milkshake was rated the highest product on their menu. And that's what can happen with leaders who take that challenge that they feel inside and they're willing to take it up. But how do leaders do this? How do great leaders challenge up? It's easy to say do it, and leaders do it, but how do you do it? Well, first of all, with the best motive. And the best motive always with leadership is about a preferred future. It's not about personal agenda. With Esther, it was not, she wasn't going to the king with any personal agenda. The preferred future was that the Jews would live, for sure. And that was what she was going to the king for, to save her nation. And the other thing leaders do is they focus on what is core. And if you're going to tackle your boss or someone senior to you in particular, but as I said, this applies actually to anybody, you need to know what is core to them, what they value, what they're pursuing. Chick-fil-A would never have agreed to changing to beef burgers. Their core business was chicken and nothing else. That's what they do. So to go to your boss and say, I want to change it and bring beef burgers, would have been a non-starter. You're not understanding your boss. You do not understand the organizational values when you make those kinds of suggestions. So you have to know what's core and focus on that. Then you need to learn to challenge up quietly. When you challenge up quietly, you need to understand there's a right time and a place. I mentioned this just now. Esther didn't tell the king what she wanted when she went into the court in his presence. Although it's interesting to note that her favor with him was such that he said to her, tell me what you want. I will give you even up to half my kingdom. And silly girl said, please come to dinner. Hey, she could have had half the kingdom. But that, you see, she's a true leader. She knew what the preferred future was. It wasn't about Esther getting half the kingdom. It was about saving the Jews. So she asked him to come to the dinner. They have lots of wine to drink and plenty to eat, and they're feeling good. And the king asks her again, what do you want, Esther? And she says, would you please come to dinner again tomorrow? And he brings Haman with him. And Haman is so pumped up about being invited. He's so full of joy and pride. He has no idea of Esther's plans going forward that is going to bring about his demise. He hasn't a clue. But he's so full of pride. In fact, if you want to do a leadership study on a positional leader, which is the lowest form of leadership, he is a wonderful study to do. He fits it perfectly. everyone must bow and scrape to him and all those kind of things. He was a true positional leader. And, so before I just go on to the next one, what I found very interesting, typically God, and typically when you do things God's way, how he orchestrates everything so beautifully. Remember, Esther was born for a time such as this. She was an orphan. She was taken from her land. She was brought into Persia, to Susa, the capital, for a time such as this. It's amazing how God orchestrates all these things. Well, that night, after Esther's had her first dinner, King Xerxes can't sleep. Maybe he had too much wine, I'm not sure. But he couldn't sleep, and he calls the courtiers and he said, bring the chronicles and read them to me. That would put me to sleep, I'm quite sure. So they start to read through all his books of all the things that have happened in the kingdom, and what comes up? Mordecai, and how he has saved King Xerxes from assassination. And Xerxes said, what did we do to honor Mordecai? Who, of course, is now hated by Haman, as you remember. And nothing was done. And he said, whoa, we have to put this right. We have to do something now to honor Mordecai. So that all happens the night before. Okay, back to this. Be sure not to embarrass when you challenge. When Esther sees the king, she didn't say to him, we're in this terrible position because of this prime minister that you appointed. She could have. How many times do you hear that sort of approach, or do we even use that sort of approach ourselves? You appointed him. It's your fault that this whole mess has occurred. You didn't even give Mordecai recognition. What kind of a king are you to do that kind of thing? There are lots of ways to finger point and blame and embarrass. She didn't even embarrass Haman in front of the court the day when the king says, I'll give you up to half my kingdom. Quietly has them in private, come to a dinner with me. So they do it quietly, you do it discreetly. One of the things that you just need to understand is when you do things publicly, or you make those kind of statements public about your husband, or about your boss, or your pastor, or those kind of things, and you say it where others hear, it sends out this hotbed of gossip. And yes, it happens in the church, let's be honest. It's going to people here and it's passed on. It's damaging, it's undermining, and leaders don't do that. You need to do things discreetly. Then the next thing you need to do to be able to be successful in your challenges is you build a bridge of relationships. John Maxwell says, touch the hearts before you ask for a hand. So win their heart first. Then you can start to ask for things. And I don't know if any of you have read Dr. Willard Harley's book, His Needs, Her Needs. If you're married, fabulous book to help anyone in their marriage. But he talks about love bang points. And love bang points are, if you think about it, just makes sense. When you do a kindness for your husband or your wife, you score points. And the little love bang, piggy bank fills up with love bang points. Or you give them affirmation, or you, whatever it is you do that makes them feel good. So your points actually start to grow. Now, should you need to make a big withdrawal and challenge something quite big with your boss, you need to have accumulated love bank points. You can't draw on a deficit. So it's your job to build up those points. And then you need to use your words as bricks to build trust. My mother used to say, there were two things she used to drum into me from being little. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. And the other thing that she used to drum into me is, if you have nothing good to say, say nothing. And if we just work with those two alone, it will be significant in building up trust. But there are some no-nos, which are bridge breakers. The first one is comparisons. We need to avoid using comparisons. You don't start a discussion with the person that you're challenging on a new process with things like their website's better than ours, comparing their website with your website. That church does it that way and it works so well in their church. but our church is not working so great. Or his wife always does those kinds of things. Or the husband always does this, and look what you do. Okay, you're going to have to listen. You know this one. There are comparison do's and there are comparison don'ts. You should try my mom's recipe. It's much better. Okay. Sorry, the sound here is not so good. We'll have to get better speakers, but you get the picture. Comparing, telling your wife that his mother cleans her kitchen better than you do and cooks better than you do and you should get her recipe is a comparison don't. Okay. The other thing we have to do, another bridge breaker, is when we make emphatic negative declarations. These are things that we always do, all of us do. That's a typical emphatic declaration. Okay, when you use always and never and forever and only, the reason that those things are a problem when you're dealing with your boss or someone in leadership is that they shut down, they're definitive statements, and they shut down conversation. They're either going to shut it down because he feels like everybody does that, or it's going to create a very nasty reaction. You're likely to get one or the other. Rather come with the attitude that we're doing this together, we're going to build and grow and develop together. Have that approach rather than coming in with your negative declarations. Then you need to avoid, these are other bridge breakers, the blame game. It's very easy to do the blame game when you're discussing changes, because you can come up with things like, if they had done their job properly in the first place, okay, that's a blame, that's finger pointing, that's blame. Or, look how that child behaving, what kind of parents are they? You just don't make those kind of blame statements. I can see this lady that you appointed, whoa, I'm not going to say that your boss, I can see this lady that you appointed didn't really know what she was doing. Now that reflects not just badly on her, on your boss as well. And the last thing you're going to do is say to your boss, you know, you didn't do such a great job here. Avoid the blame game completely. New ideas are challenging enough without adding blame onto them as well. And then this is the last one to do here, is avoid ultimatums. Ultimatums come out in forms like, if you don't give me the budget I need, I won't be able to do the job. Because now you're saying, what if your boss can't give you the budget? It sounds like you're very close-minded and arrogant and judgmental, and you're not going to even try to do something if he doesn't have the budget. It's your way or the highway. That's what's coming across. That's how it gets interpreted back. And it's not going to work. You say things, it's not going to work if this or this. Those are ultimatums. And the ultimate ultimatum, I won't be able to continue working here if I don't get this. Threatening to leave your job if you don't get what you want. It's your job to keep the team motivated, and ultimatums undermine. So you've got to be very careful. And you know what? How often do we use ultimatums? Even I've seen it with kids. I did it with my own kids. If you don't keep quiet, you're going to sit in your bedroom all day today. You know jolly well that ultimatum isn't one you're going to follow through on. So don't use ultimatums, and especially not an ultimatum that you're actually going to actually follow through with. Leaders build trust. So you need to start with your heart. You have to choose to love. And yes, I am talking about your boss and your pastor. We're talking about 1 Corinthians 13 love. You do have to love them. You have to choose to love them. God requires that you love them. Because when you love, you want what is best for that person. We're talking about that kind of love. And here's a scripture I just want to go through with you. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. And after that, it goes on to the mindset of Christ Jesus is that he who was King of Kings and Lord of Lords became someone of no reputation. So it's quite a thing for us to think about when we are dealing with people on a challenge basis. See yourselves as lowly, not because you are unworthy, but because you are seeking to see the best in the situation, in this person that you are loving at the moment. So what I would say to you is try to find the best and most generous explanation for each other's behavior and then stick with that. Then you need to believe, here's another scripture, I forgot I put this in. This is what love does. This is why you love others. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. And when you look at the person that you're challenging in that context, you're going to see them completely differently. Right. Believe that God places people in authority. If you believe that about the person you're challenging, you're going to challenge them in a very different way, because to challenge someone that God has placed in authority is to challenge God himself. And that is a very sobering thing for us to think about. Then we need to be faithful in the little things. Learn to be trusted with little, because then your boss is going to trust you with much. Scriptural. Pick up the tasks that no one else wants to do, tasks that need to be done, but no one else wants to do them. You pick them up and run with them. Your boss is soon going to learn, or your pastor, when they see you taking on these things, is going to learn to trust you. It's going to build that trust relationship. Then you learn to disagree when emotions are low. This is such an important thing in challenging anything, anytime. Whether you're challenging your husband or your wife or your kids, don't tackle them when your emotions are high. Choose a time when your emotions are low. That is what Esther did. She waited, she had her dinners, she waited until they were in a place of calm as well. And something that I would encourage you to do when you've built up this trust relationship, ask your boss, if I disagree with you on something, how would you like me to raise it? Because we're not going to agree all the time. But if I do disagree with something, how would you like me to raise it? It's a good question to ask yourself. If somebody's going to disagree with you, how would you like them to raise it with you? So that you'll respond in a positive, open way. I know for me, if you're going to challenge me on something, I want you to just shoot straight, finished. I'm happy to be wounded a little bit after the shot and then process it from there, but I don't like when people start that, I just want to say, would you just get to the point? Just say what you want to say. That's me. We're all different. Other people don't want to be shot straight out like that. I do. It's my preferred approach. Unfortunately, because I prefer that for myself, I tend to do that with others, and others don't like it. So I have to learn this lesson for myself as well, to not challenge on that basis. And then champion publicly and challenge privately And never mix those two up. Never champion privately and challenge publicly. You are trying to respect the dignity of the person with whom you are dealing. So, one of the ways of doing it, and we're talking about sincere affirmation, okay? We're not talking about brown-nosing affirmation. We're talking about genuine, sincere affirmation. Because when it's sincere, it means something. And the people that are listening, they know when you are telling the truth about your boss. And it's good for your boss or your pastor or whoever it is that you are affirming at the time. It's powerful for them. And then you challenge them in private, which is what we saw Esther did as well. And then consider all the facts. The reason I put this in because, as I mentioned earlier, we see the world differently. We perceive things differently. We have our point of view. We see our point of view as the facts, but you need to hear their point of view. You have to consider all the facts. You have to validate what they have to say, their approach, and do this together. We work together to work through different views, different ideas, after validation. And then this one, remain emotionally neutral. Not such an easy one to do. Sleep on it for 24 hours. Wait till your emotions have subsided. You actually cannot think rationally when you're emotional. Physiologically, our cognitive ability literally declines when we are emotionally charged. They did an evaluation with people who are emotionally charged. Even in a place where you're meeting people, you can actually forget people's names when you're emotionally charged. Even to that limited extent, being emotionally charged has an effect on you. So it says, be angry, yet do not sin. And whenever you go into a challenge, I'm just going to summarize after this, so we're right at the end now. This is a very important part of the challenge. You have to be okay with no. If the person you're challenging says no, you have to be okay with that. Be prepared for it. You can always try again later when you've got more evidence to support what you reckon is a preferred future. You can always go back again or look for a better time when the boss is in a more favorable situation, money's come into the bank, various things have changed, then bring it up again. But be okay with no. And you know what? You thought you could submit. Submission only occurs when it's a no. Esther had already decided she was okay with a no. And if it was a no for her to come into the king's presence, she would perish. We have to be okay with the no's. Hopefully we're not going to perish. Okay, so these are the leadership lessons from Esther. She used her position, her voice, and her faith for good to save a nation. You have got a position, you have got a voice, you have got faith. We all have that. I have that. Am I using it for a preferred future in the places where God has planted me currently? Esther was chosen for a time such as this. Our lives have meaning and purpose. And I just quickly want to just challenge you on something here when it comes to purpose. Was her entire purpose just to save the nation of Israel? If I was to say yes, then I would have to say Esther had no purpose before, and Esther had no purpose afterwards. That cannot be in the God we serve. We have got purpose every single day that we exist. But did she have a very specific God-given purpose here? Yes, she did. I've been through a transition in my life. It was easy when I was a teacher to see my purpose. I could see my purpose as a teacher because I was affecting children's lives on a daily basis in the classroom, loving them, teaching them, preparing them for a future. I felt that sense of purpose when I was in the classroom. When I became principal, my purpose felt even more significant to me. I was making an impact in the teachers' lives more than the children, but I knew it would go from the teachers to the children, and it became even more significant in terms of my purpose. Then came retirement. And you know what? I felt like I was purposeless. I did. I'm being vulnerable and honest with you. I felt like, now what? I've got no purpose. What am I going to do with myself? My only two passions have always been education and food. So now I'm in food. But you know what? After I started this, I asked God regularly, why am I doing, apart from the fact it's not your fault, God, that I'm doing it. I set this thing up. But why am I doing this? It's like I don't feel like I have purpose. And then I had to challenge myself, or God certainly challenged me on a daily basis. I pray, God, I don't know who's coming in my shop today. I don't know whose life I can make a difference in, but I am willing and I'm open. I recognize I have purpose. I have purpose when I meet people, when I speak to people. You'd be amazed how many people have come in the shop, they've sat there crying, and I've ended up ministering to them and praying with them. And God uses the little things in our lives. So we're not all going to have saving the Jewish nation as our purpose, but we have purpose. And we need to seek God for purpose on a daily basis. Esther spent time in prayer and fasting to seek God's guidance and favor. Always the best place for us to start, on our knees before our God. She acted with courage. It does take courage when you have big challenges ahead of you. She was resourceful. She used the resources at her disposal to achieve what she needed to achieve. This is a very interesting thing for you to just sober up on as we come to the end. If she had not acted, God would have found someone else. Leaders change the status quo to make things better. And this, I think, is very significant for us. God wants to partner with us in his mission. What we do daily, what we do monthly, God wants to do it with us. Leaders have to be willing to lay their life down. Servant leaders put others first. And this, to think about, Esther did not become a great leader until she realized you have to be willing to die for your people. If Esther had not gone to the king, if she had, or had even gone to the king with a different approach, and it was not if I perish, she wouldn't be as significant to us as she is today. It's the fact that she was willing to lay down her life that makes Esther stand out, up and above other women that you might hear about. This was a woman of substance. We are people of the Most High King. We are people of substance. Martin Luther King Jr. said, a man who won't die for something is not fit to live. So, how do we do it going from here as we walk out the door today? It's very simple. Take it in small bite-sized chunks. Be better tomorrow than you are today. Because as children of the Most High God, you were born for this. You were born for 2018, for such a time such as this. Amen.